Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Near the end of part 2 of his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, Immanuel Kant is going to talk not just about laws of nature, as he has been through this entire section, but about a distinction between what we can call universal or pure laws of nature and then empirical laws of nature, both of which natural science is concerned with, and you could say is made out of. And how do we get there? Well, he begins in part 36 asking this question: how is nature itself possible? And he says that this question properly contains two distinct questions which are interrelated to each other. So both of these have meanings or senses, Bedeutung, right? There's a material sense and a formal sense. And here Kant is, using some sort of old-fashioned language that was quite established in his time, particularly in scholastic philosophy and in early modern philosophy as well. So the material sense, you could think about it in terms of form and content as well. The material sense, he says, how is nature possible in general in this sense? That is, according to intuition, Anschauung, as the totality of appearances. He's going to use this term totality in both of them. And now we get a little bit more specific. How are space, time, and that which fills both, the object of sensation, possible in general? Now, some of this we've already talked about in previous sections. And he says, well, the answer is by means of the constitution, the Beschaffenheit, right? How something is made, how something has been created or generated, the constitution of sensibility, Sinnlichkeit, right? So he says, according to which it is, in its special way, the sensibility, affected by objects which are in themselves unknown to it, the things in themselves, the noumena, and totally distinct from those appearances, those Erscheinungen. And so he says, I've talked about this in the critique. We don't need to go into this any further. What we're really more concerned with here is the formal sense. And what is he asking about here? How is nature possible in this sense as the totality of the rules, the Regeln, under which all appearances must come in order to be thought as connected in an experience? So, we get from sensibility and intuition through it, we get appearances, and then what do we do with those? We bring them under rules. And we do so without even consciously thinking about it. This is the way that we apprehend a world outside. This is the way we have experience in the first place. So I said, well, the answer to this is it's only possible by means of the constitution, again, Beschaffenheit, of our understanding. So we've got these two different faculties which are intimately connected: sensibility, which is lower in some respect, the understanding, which is higher and more determinative in some respect, and each of them is handling, you could say, a different set of tasks. And so he says, all those representations of sensibility are referred to a consciousness, and by which the peculiar way in which we think, that is, by rules, we think using logical determinations, connecting things together. So he says, hence also experience is possible, but also must be clearly distinguished from insight into the objects in itself. So we're sticking to the world of possible experience. He goes on and he says that, when it comes to these laws of nature, there are many which we can only know by means of experience. So by actually looking at things, experiencing things, measuring things, So this is indeed what a lot of natural science does consist in. So Kant, for example, doesn't really talk about chemistry here. He talks about physics and about geometry. But he could talk about chemistry and say, well, you actually do have to perform experiments if you want to know something about how certain things interact with each other. So experience is indeed important, but we don't learn about all of the laws of nature through experience, through experimentation, through correlating these things. There are some laws, and these are by far the most important ones, that precede experience. So he says we can't discover the conformity to law in the connection of appearances, nature in general, by any experience. Why? Because experience itself requires that we have laws which are a priori at the very basis of its possibility, the possibility of experience. So we've already seen this in the discussion of the judgments of perception and the judgments of experience. What differentiates them? Well, in the judgments of experience, we are bringing pure ideas of the understanding to bear in there. So we're adding something in, you could say. So this is what gets us to pure or universal laws of nature, which he is going to say are here we go. The possibility of experience in general is therefore at the same time the universal law of nature, and the principles of experience are the very laws of nature. Why? Because we only know nature as the totality of appearances, representations in us, so we can only derive the law of their connection from the principles of their connection in us, in our consciousness. This is the very possibility of having experience, and Kant is going to call these universal or pure laws of nature the highest legislation, and he's going to say that this highest legislation lies in ourselves. And where does it lie in ourselves? Well, primarily in sensibility and the understanding. So he's going to go on and say that here we go. We must not seek the universal laws of nature in nature by means of experience. We must seek nature as to its universal conformity to law in the conditions of the possibility of experience, which lie in, notice he says two things, our sensibility and our understanding. We need both of these in order to be able to derive these universal or pure laws of nature. And he goes on a little bit later, and he's going to say that the understanding does not derive laws from nature, right? But rather prescribes them to nature. So what our understanding is doing, this is not exactly what Kant says, but if we want to sort of wrap our heads around it in contemporary language, our understanding is continually projecting onto whatever it is that we could experience, all this structure, this order, these law-like connections between things. It's doing it all the time. That's why we're able to have experience in the first place, which then we can derive some, other laws of nature from, what he calls the empirical, experiential laws of nature. And he tells us that these presuppose, voraussetzen, they are setting out in advance particular, besondere, perceptions, Wahrnehmungen, right? Perception is not yet the same thing as experience for Immanuel Kant. We've seen the judgment of perception, judgment of experience, two different things, right? So empirical laws of nature, in order to have those, we actually have to do observation experientially within the world, and then we can, come up with things. But the very possibility of doing that is based on having universal or pure laws of nature. So both of these are important for natural science, and both of them are heavily involved in what we're doing. Now, he's going to give us some interesting examples. But before we look at the examples, we should think about what are these examples supposed to demonstrate or prove or at least illustrate to us? And Kant is going to tell us after providing them. He says, here is nature resting on laws which the understanding cognizes a priori, chiefly from universal principles of the determination of space. And he says, do the laws of nature lie in space? Does the understanding learn them by merely endeavoring to find out the enormous wealth of meaning that lies in space? No, it's the other way around. He says, the mere universal form of intuition called space is the substratum of intuitions determinable to particular objects. They exist in space. And in it, of course, the condition of the possibility and of the variety of these intuitions lies. But, very important but here, the unity of the objects is determined entirely by the understanding, and according to conditions which lie in its own nature, the nature of the understanding. Thus, the understanding is the origin of the universal order of nature, right? So this is really an important, pivotal point here. So what are the examples that he provides? He talks about the properties of a circle. So we draw a circle. We have some chords, which are lines that are intersecting each other and the circle. And they are always divided so the rectangle constructed with the segments of the one is equal to that constructed with the segments of the other. Doing basic geometry stuff that you may have done in your high school geometry class or you could get out of a textbook. Kant says, all right, what's important about this? Does this law, the law about these being equal to each other, lie in the circle, in the thing itself that we're observing, or does it lie in the understanding? He says, does the figure independently of the understanding contain in itself the ground of the law, or does the understanding, having constructed according to its concepts, what are they? The equality of the radii, the figure itself, introduce into it this law of the chords. And Kant says it's the latter. The understanding is providing you with the laws in this case, right? And he says if we enlarge this concept to look at other geometric figures under common laws and consider the circle as a conic section, so a cone, a three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional object, he says, we find that the chords which intersect within the circle, ellipse, parabola, always intersect so that the rectangles of their segments are not equal. Looks like we have a different law here, but always bear a constant ratio to each other, right? So when we're doing geometry, something that we discussed in the previous section, right? We see that the understanding is prescribing the rules. What about another thing that seems to be empirical? Universal attraction of matter to each other, mutual attraction as well, or as we call it, gravity or gravitation, right? It says if we proceed to the fundamental doctrines of physical astronomy, we find that there's a physical law of reciprocal attraction, the rule of which is that it decreases inversely as the square of the distance from each attracting points. So we've got a mathematical or mathematizable connection, which we can observe in nature. We can do that because the understanding is actually, according to Kant, prescribing the very order, the structure, the rules of nature by means of the universal pure laws of nature to what it is that we are observing. So that's what these examples are supposed to lead us towards. So we've got this distinction now between pure and empirical laws of nature. They're both part of natural science, but one is far more important. One is the ground for the other, and it comes from the Constitution, the way things are set up, the way things, if we want to be very literal about Beschaffenheit, the way things are made with these two faculties of sensibility and the much more important one, the understanding.